Welcome to KGO. My name is Brent Walters. You're listening to God Talk. This morning we have some very fascinating things to talk about, some quite disturbing, but not only historical, but help us to kind of make sense of some of the issues that we face in our own society, especially with regard to questions of when life begins. And we're going to look at especially three topics: exposure, abortion, and infanticide in the ancient world. This is adult material. It is serious material. It helps us put together pieces of our history and our puzzle that makes us, unique from other cultures in the way that we address these things. We're going to look at ancient Greece and Rome, Jews and Christians, and see if we can't make an overall kind of tapestry out of what the ancient world said, not just about these practices or customs, but also about when life begins, what constitutes life, when the soul emerges, and the kinds of issues that led us to the debates we have today over these same things, about abortion especially. So if you bear with me this morning as we begin to plow through this, I think you'll find it fascinating. It has an awful lot of overtones that will help us make sense of our current debate on these subjects. And there's an awful lot of fascinating history that is attached to it. On the third hour this morning, we have our guest. We're going to have Mark Goodacre here. We'll talk about him throughout the next couple of hours. He's at Duke University, and I'm looking forward to having our conversation with him as well. Let me begin by saying that exposure of an unwanted newborn infant for another to retrieve was an accepted practice in some nations of the ancient world. Now, it usually involved placing a child in a clay vessel on the side of a road or at a designated area near the city, at the mercy of animals and hostilities of climate, hunger, and predators. Motives for exposing an infant varied widely, including poverty, deformity, illegitimacy, vanity. Because girls were perceived as financial liabilities, due in no small part to the dowry expected at marriage, they were more often victims of this custom. Boys were likewise exposed. Women who were unable to bear children or unwilling to do so adopted a few of these newborns abandoned in the fields or abandoned on the streets. However, self-serving opportunists collected the less fortunate infants and sold them for the slave trade or prostitution, begging, or other forms of servitude. Closely related to exposure was infanticide, for during some eras of the Greco-Roman world and its history, the father had power of life and death over his family. Now, this reflects the general status of children in antiquity. Abortion was also quite prevalent, especially as recorded in the literature of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Several incentives compelled its procurement, but the two most common were poverty and the concealment of adultery. Another impetus for abortion was the preservation of a woman's figure and youthfulness. Even though the practice flourished, a few legal restrictions and ethical objections were introduced to curb it, since physicians, pharmaceutical dealers, abortionists, all were able to perform them. Hippocrates, the 5th century father of medicine, he composed a very famous medical oath for doctors in his guild, and it also prohibited abortion. Gynecologists and medical professionals recommended different compositions for those medicinally induced. And most of the surgical techniques available at the time were so crude and so dangerous as to endanger not only the life of the mother, but endanger her permanently, scar her permanently, or in some ways make her incapable of having children to follow. However, not every religious tradition engaged in the custom, and this includes Jews and Christians, among others, both of which developed arguments that rephrased the question of when life begins. And I want to look at that this morning as well as the overall theme, because there's something in this argument that has not changed for 2,500 years. Now, I don't have an axe to grind. I'm just telling the facts based upon the documents that have survived. I'm not using personal opinion. And you'll see that I quote a lot of people throughout, or paraphrase a lot of people throughout history of this early period in order to kind of make sense of what the argument is, because it's a valuable argument, because it helps us also determine the existence of life, the viability of the soul, and the things that are religiously themed with regard to exposure, abortion, and infanticide. In many centers of the ancient world, newborns were exposed to the mercy of beasts and birds and climate and hunger, and this was all done, by the way, without legal repercussions from local or even imperial magistrates. But there's no doubt the greatest predator of all was human in variety. Motives for exposing a child varied widely. Some of the factors included poverty or illegitimacy or even downright desperation. An infant was also exposed because the family was large. Additional heirs were viewed as lessening the inheritance that each received. Many fathers perceived girls to be financial liabilities, not just because of the dowry, but also because they were not able to work like boys in the family business, although it's true that boys were also exposed. While most were left to die, women who were unable or unwilling to bear children sometimes retrieved them, and we read this in Juvenal, who lived between 60 and 140 CE. He was far more cynical, by the way, in his treatment of the practice, for he reported that wealthy women were unwilling to face childbirth due to fear of pain or loss of beauty and figure. Instead, he claimed that most adopted an abandoned child if they desired motherhood. However, by no means were all the exposed newborns recovered for reasons of compassion. Those left to the elements faced a formidable horde of opportunists who raised children for self-serving and dishonorable purposes. Some of those retrieved were raised as slaves for domestic and foreign purchase. Others were cultivated as gladiators for the numerous arenas of the Mediterranean world or as prostitutes for the countless brothels of Rome. Since far more newborn girls than boys were exposed, this latter fate was tragically prevalent. Other miseries also awaited exposed infants, such as those who took advantage of their helpless condition and deliberately injured or maimed them in order to solicit others as pathetic beggars. So there's all sorts of reasons that people would do this. I'm not saying any of them are rational by our standard, but what enabled it was that there was no ethical consequence. There seems to be no conscience attached to abandoning a newborn baby. And I want to get into the mindset that allowed this and the culture that permitted it to the point where it's actually forcing children into slave labor for their entire lives, based solely upon an unwillingness of parents to keep children. Now, does this relate today? Well, it will when we move further into this topic. But for now, just understand I'm setting a framework for one of the most important arguments, discussions, debates in the world today. When does life begin? We'll be back with Seneca the Elder and determining what he had to say about this as well as others. All coming up this morning on God Talk. My name is Brent Walters, and you're listening to KGO.